Welcome to our very first all-digital Pass the Torch program, coming to you from the comforts of our living rooms and home offices. My name is Joseph Vick, Manager of Museum Education at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And today's program is entitled Stories Behind the Exhibits, an Outward Odyssey book series space history author panel discussion on the importance of museums and the valuable history they teach us all. So let's begin with a warm welcome and introduction to our panelists. First, we have Dr. Chris Gainor. He is a historian of technology and writer of specializing in space exploration and aeronautics. He is the editor of Quest, the History of Spaceflight Quarterly, and is president of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Chris holds a PhD in the history of technology from the University of Alberta. His 2008 Outward Odyssey series book, To a Distant Day, The Rocket Pioneers, addresses the history of early rocket scientists and astronaut history pioneers, from ancient Chinese gunpowder to the first man in space. His sixth book, Not Yet Imagined, a study of Hubble Space Telescope operations, is due to be published later this year by NASA. His fifth book, The Bomb in America's Missile Age, was published in 2018. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be here.
Jay Gallentine has authored 2 Outward Odyssey books, with a third underway. His research focuses on the minutiae of unmanned lunar and planetary missions. His writing is known for the lighthearted, conversational, and non-technical style. Jay is also known for his lively and animated public talks, and his first Outward Odyssey book, Ambassadors from Earth, won the 2009 Eugene Emmy Award for Astronomical Literature. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Richard Jurek is the author of The Ultimate Engineer, The Remarkable Life of NASA's Visionary Leader George M. Low, and co-author of Marketing the Moon, The Selling of the Apollo Lunar Program. A contributor to Air and Space magazine and website, he authored the January 2019 cover story, The Man Who Won the Moon Race, a profile of George Low as Apollo program manager and his role in the Apollo 8 decision. He served as the consulting producer on the award-winning PBS American Experience miniseries, Chasing the Moon, and he is also a frequent commentator and speaker on NASA history, especially concerning his historic public affair events and pioneering brand journalism. He has appeared internationally for media outlets such as Forbes, Slate, NBC News, CBS News, Canadian Public Radio, Australian Public Radio, U.S. National Public Radio, NPR's Backstory with the History Guys, and other popular media outlets. And marketing and communications executive for the past quarter century, he lives and works in the greater Chicagoland area. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Joseph, and I'll cut that back next time.
Emeline Paat-Dahlstrom is an author, speaker, and space entrepreneur. She is the co-founder of International Space Constituents and Space Consultants and Space Base, a social enterprise working to democratize across to space by catalyzing space ecosystems in emerging countries. Starting with New Zealand, Emeline is an Edmund Hillary Fellow, currently residing in Christchurch, New Zealand. She is the former Chief Impact Officer and Space Facility Lead of Singularity University in California. Emeline has physics and earth and space science degrees and attends the International Space University Space Studies program, where she helped develop and run its master's and summer space studies programs. She has worked and consulted for several space companies, including Space Adventures, Zero Gravity Corporation, and Odyssey Moon. She currently advertises space startups, including Sarah's robotics and extracurricular power are extraterrestrial power in their plans for commercial lunar missions. She is currently an associate editor for New Space Journal, a global citizen and adventure seeker. She has lived and worked in 10 countries and has visited over 85 countries on 7 continents. Emeline is co-author of the book Realizing Tomorrow, The Path to Private Space Flight, which was selected in 2013 for the U.S. Air Force's Chief of Staff reading list. Welcome, Emeline.
Thanks for having me as well. And I have to cut that back too.
Well, you've all done a collective so much for history and space and business and commercial space. So I applaud you all. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question. And we'll start this question with Chris. We'll start with you and go around. But Chris, please describe your first ever life-changing museum experience, that aha moment that made you realize you were a fellow space geek. If you can remember the exact exhibit or artifact, please elaborate.
Well, I think one fine morning a long time ago, my father got up unusually early to watch something on TV. This is back when we only had 2 channels, and usually there wasn't anything on that early. And I believe he was up to watch John Glenn. So of course I got up to see what this is all about, and I kind of got hooked. I was following those missions, and but when Gemini got going in 1965, I can remember seeing the TV guide and the cutaway picture of the Gemini spacecraft that I think all of us are familiar with. So, oh boy, they're flying again, because of course we had no internet, no nothing. You just were at the mercy of the newspapers basically, and so Gemini got going, and I was really hooked, so people, a couple of books I was looking at back then. There's this one, which a lot of people would get these series of books from Life magazine, Time Life, and one of them was about space. And I remember the copy we had at home, I wore out.
And then, what was that exact title, Chris? We saw half of it on the screen. Man in Space.
Man in Space. And I apologize for the quality of the picture. This is actually why I was trying to use my other computer, which is still booting up. I had to run another computer. We'd still be waiting. Anyway, and then our local TV station in Calgary, Alberta, where I lived at the time, put this book on sale, and this is about Gemini 4, the first spacewalk. You should be able to see Ed White there, and so the original copy of that book, I think I still have it, but it's just so beat up. I got another one, but that was a very early one. So by the time Apollo went to the moon, I was already a veteran space geek, and when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, I actually won a bet that I'd made years before with one of my father's friends that the United States would beat Russia to the moon.
Well, great. Well, it seems as though your love for space literature started when it started. So that is great, and you saw it firsthand. Let's move. Jay, what was your aha moment? What was your first life-changing museum space experience?
Well, grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and so there really weren't. There's a space museum now in Nebraska, actually, but at the time there was nothing down there. My interest in space, I firmly believe, is my dad's fault, because he had a way of just sort of introducing me to things. I came home one day from school in 5th grade, and he handed me a package, and he had ordered this book on Apollo from the NASA government printing office, and I didn't ask for it, and I had never heard of it. And I said, "Why did you give this to me?" And he said, "Well, I just thought you'd be interested in that." And that was kind of Dad's way about a lot of things. And then one day I came home in middle school or high school or something like that, and Dad was standing there with his shoes on and his car keys, and he said, "Get in the car." I'm like, "Where are we going?" "Just get in the car." And we drove to a jewelry store that was a big Omega dealership, and they had I don't know if it was a flight spare or what. It was incredibly highly detailed. It was not a model. It was the lunar rover, the Apollo lunar rover, and they had just cleared out space in their showroom, and it was, you know, this whole thing with Omega's tie-in to the moon landings and the Speedmaster Moonwatch and all that stuff. And you know, and Dad didn't say a word. He just kind of led me in, and we just stood in front of it, and it was, again, one of those things where, oh, I just thought you might be interested in that. And, you know, and suddenly I wanted, and they had a backpack too in one of the rover seats, and I just wanted to know everything about this stuff. And that Apollo book, which I still have today, I didn't even read the words in it forever. I just kind of looked at the pictures, and I was like, "Are you telling me this really happened?" And yeah. And then I wanted to go to the library and see more. And it wasn't until I was an adult, actually, and went to the Smithsonian that I really went to my first space museum. And I think I spent 2 days in almost complete silence, just slowly wandering around, staring at everything and going, wow, wow, wow. So there you go.
So, Richard, what was your aha moment in seeing the first museum?
Yeah, for me, it starts with the fact that the earliest memory I have as a child is of a Saturn V rocket on a TV screen. So for me, and it's a story I tell often whenever I'm giving speeches, just growing up, it's an indelible memory. I remember the black and white picture on a large Zenith wooden console TV screen. I'm sitting on the green shag carpet of my parents' south side of Chicago house, and I can see the TV off in the distance. My mom is somewhere in the kitchen on the phone with one of those mile-long cords so she can iron, talk, and keep an eye on me watching TV. And it is an indelible, emotional moment, and it's the earliest memory as a child. And when we would go into Chicago, we lived on the far south side of Chicago. When we would go into the city, we would go museum hopping. And my favorite, bar none, was the Museum of Science and Industry, the MSI in Chicago. And they have the amazing Apollo 8 spacecraft. They've had it since 1971. And being landlocked in the center of the country, you know, we don't get to see rocket launches, but we had the Apollo 8 space capsule. And when you go through that amazing museum, you know, there's the U-505 that's there. You've got all these displays on coal mining and the oil industry, trains, planes, automobiles. Yeah, I liked it. But when, almost like Jay's experience, when I would walk up to that Apollo 8 capsule, I felt that emotion again, that indelible sort of connection to that early memory. And it would always trigger a sense of satisfaction, a sense of pleasure, a sense of awe. And I have spent countless hours just staring into the Apollo 8 spacecraft at the MSI, just attached back to those memories. And it is like a time machine. And so for me, whenever I go to a museum now, whether it's the Smithsonian, whether it's down at Kennedy, whether it's at, I don't know, the Cosmosphere, and you name the museum, it is only in the space section that I get that feel, that connection, that sort of global experience that I had as a child with the rest of the world. And so for me, that's when I knew space geek all the way from day one.
All right. Emeline, as a world traveler, you've probably seen your fair share of museums, but what was that first one, that first experience for you?
Yeah. So I was born in the Philippines and I lived there basically for like half my life. And there really is no space or science for that matter museum to kind of like look at. So when I finally got to the Air and Space Museum in Washington D.C., it's like it's like a kid in a candy store essentially. You see all of this just famous the Wright Flyer to the capsules to X1 to the Spirit of St. Louis, all in kind of like one place, and it's just amazing that I've only read about all of these, prior, and there they are. They're all there. But actually, my aha moment was really years after when I came back to the Air and Space Museum and I saw Dennis Tito's his spacesuit and his gloves. So for people who may have forgotten, Dennis Tito is the first space tourist. So he was the first one who paid for his flight to go to the ISS and stayed there for like 10 days. And for me, it's significant because I was actually in Baikonur during his flight. And I was working for Space Adventures at that time. It was the company that brokered the deal for him to go on a Soyuz rocket. And so I was part of the group that brought his family and his friends to Baikonur. And we were, they're actually very lenient there. You can be like right at the foot of the rocket just a few hours before it. And we were being rained, kind of like condensation was raining on us. And like you've got the Soyuz like right there, and Dennis Tito was just like weaving through to get to the rocket. So for me, it was just really so palpable that coming back to the Air and Space Museum and seeing that spacesuit, and I felt that I was part of the team that actually kind of like made that happen and kind of like opened up the space tourism business. So to me, it was like really just a great feeling. So that's just one of those. There's a lot more, but yeah.
All right. Now, I'm a little curious, you being so close to it, were you as close to see? I know in Soviet era and Russian era, their ceremony of preparing the astronauts is so much grander than ours, with sending in the priest and blessing and
Yes.
all the above. Were you there able to see or that close to the experience with the family?
Actually, I was taking a lot of photos during that time, and yeah, there's a priest that kind of like blesses them, and then also even that tradition of the bus that takes them to before they get to the Soyuz rocket, it stops. And then they're supposed to pee on the wheel because Gagarin actually did that during his launch, and so now it became a tradition. So we were very
Yeah.
near, kind of to see that.
Well, that's exciting. Now, we'll go back to Chris. You mentioned early publications of the space race and American space program, but what was the first book or historical event you remember reading and experiencing firsthand that inspired you to become an author?
Oh, well, that's that's a good question. I'll just step back a little bit. Uh, when I first got into it, of course, there weren't really any museums worth mentioning. So I've been to a lot of museums over the years, but later in my life. But what got me into writing a book? Um, uh, well, it's interesting. People knew I was interested in books or in space for a long time, and my wife is in the book business. A lot of my friends are in the book business. My best friend who introduced me to my wife is a book publisher, although not in this field particularly. And people were always saying to me, "Well, Gainor, when are you going to write a space book?" And I just something about me. I just I like to find something that's a little different, something that's new, and um, and so uh, in 1994, the National Space Society held for the first time their International Space Development Conference outside of the United States. They held it in Toronto. Now I live out on the West Coast, but happened to have a trip on to Toronto at that time, and so I just had to adjust my dates. I thought this is going to be great. You know, I'm going to hang out with Buzz Aldrin and all these other people, and just space for a whole weekend. You know, what could be better than that? So I went there, uh, and not really on the program, but going on was a reunion of all these people who had gone to NASA in the late 50s and early 60s uh, from Canada, and some of them originated in England. And they just gave them a room to sit there and talk, you know, just talk about what they'd done. What had happened is that the Canadian government had canceled an aircraft program called the Avro Aero in 1959, and NASA hired about 36 of them um, in 1959, and so I sat there, and we had all heard about it back in the 60s. You know, I had a whole pile of clippings, but I hadn't thought about it for a long time. And there are these guys right in front of me telling all these stories. I thought, here's my book, and uh, and so I did write my first book, which was about these people. It's called Arrows to the Moon, and it was kind of a good thing because it kind of got Apollo out of my system, and I've been able to do books about other things. And But you know, the contribution I think I made to the history of Apollo is somewhat original, and you know it's and and so since then uh, I've been doing things from other eras. For example, the book I did for University of Nebraska is about basically everything that happened before Gagarin's flight. And then I've also done that with my most recent book, uh, you know, what's it called? The Bomb in America's Missile Age, which is basically about how and why the U.S. government went ahead with the Atlas missile, which is, of course, a key part of the Mercury and Gemini programs for that matter. So that's kind of how I got started writing. But yeah, shortly after I'd done Arrows to the Moon, I got a call from Colin Burgess, and he said, "Do you want to do this book for the Outward Odyssey series?"
Well, that's great. It sounds as though your direct encounters with the primary sources really paved your way to be a space author. You
That's
getting
right.
to meet the who's who of what was early space and astronautics and early rocket pioneers solidified your becoming an author.
That's right.
All right, Jay, what was your experience? What was your first encounter with space literature? What was something that inspired you?
Well, I've been thinking about this a little bit while Chris was talking, and I'm not sure if this will answer the question, but I was always a space geek. I think from the time where my dad gave me that first book on Apollo, I I still think that was kind of the turning point, the first door opening, if that made sense. But I didn't know really that I was interested in writing, I guess, until I was in fourth grade in Ms. Pooley's class. And Ms. Pooley gave us an assignment that we had to write 2 or 3 pages about anything, could be anything. And being the time period that it was, I wrote 2 to 3 pages on like a Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica mashup that today we would call fan fiction. And when I sat down with a blank sheet of paper, I was angry at Ms. Pooley because I didn't want to do this. I wanted to be out doing really just about anything else. And over the course of those 2 to 3 pages, I found that I really enjoyed the process. And And when I was done, and I never admitted this to Ms. Pooley, but I had actually enjoyed that process. And sometimes I give talks to schools, and I'll say, you know, we all have these things that we really enjoy doing that we just feel like we have to do. And after that paper for Ms. Pooley, on weekends I would just have to get up and write about something. It was just, I just had to sit down and do it. And it was a lot of fan fiction, but the more space books I read, and then the shuttle era was really starting to become a thing there, and the flights were going, and the testing program was wrapping up there in the early 80s. And I wanted to write more and more about it, but I didn't know what to write, so I would read some more space books, and I would take inspiration from that, and then I would make stuff up, and it was still kind of, you know, science fiction-ish, sort of in a shuttle era and everything. But I'd have to say that Ms. Pooley was the real impetus. So, you know, she put that kind of with my inherent space geekiness that had always been sort of lurking there in the background. And then it's all kind of been downhill ever since.
So it was that push from that teacher inspiration, so that sort of jolted you into authorship.
It was, yeah, and I still believe to this day it's one of those things where you don't know that you like a food until you're forced to try it. And I don't know that I would have enjoyed writing from that age had a teacher not made me sit down and write something.
So she was sort of like the coach, because I know athletes that push certain or help you exercise certain muscles. She helped you exercise your writing muscle. The athlete author.
She did, yes, in a relentless taskmaster kind of way, yes.
Right. Well, Richard, what was your first piece of space literature that inspired you to become an author?
Yeah, so for me, I'm a marketer by profession. So I'm a chief marketing officer and chief communications officer. And I studied language and literature in college. I did my undergrad in literature, did my grad degree in creative writing. And so for me, language has always been a tool that I've used, whether it's writing memos, annual reports, or industry articles. But as a child of the Apollo generation, and like Jay and Chris mentioned, just being an inherent space geek, I'd always had a fascination with nonfiction, number one, more so than sci-fi, really nonfiction. And growing up in the late 60s and early 70s, I was a prime target for the Cosmos TV series that came out in 1980. So Carl Sagan really grabbed a hold of me once again through the TV tube. But what fascinated me was the companion book for Cosmos, which was a bit more like a coffee table book. It was massive, wonderful photography, fantastic narrative. And you couldn't help but read that book with Sagan's voice and billions echoing in your mind as you were going through it. And it helps science come to life for me. It helps space, once again, come to life for me. And I had that same sort of triggering moment that I had with watching that Saturn V on TV and seeing the Apollo 8 spacecraft at the MSI. And so those things all tended to come together. And as a marketer, my co-author on Marketing the Moon is a very famous writer of marketing books, David Merriman Scott. He's kind of written the Bible of social media marketing called The New Rules of Marketing and PR. And David and I are both space geeks, and we would meet down at the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation events down in Florida, and we'd compare notes. And when we would talk to the astronauts, they'd give the canned answer to everybody on the standard, how did you go to bathroom in space? What was it like, etc. But when David and I would to them, we would come to them from our professional angle of marketing, which they normally didn't get a question like that. We wanted to know, were they scripted? What was it like to interact with the contractor marketing people? What was it like your week in the barrel? They lit up. It was like, oh my God, a fresh question. And that converted into us collaborating on the first book, which was Marketing the Moon. And that put me on the map for Colin Burgess, the editor at Outward Odyssey, for the George Low biography, which I consider one of the greatest privileges of my life, to go into Low's background and story and study a man who was so seminal to the space program from its inception all the way through to shuttle, but most people don't know his name. And so I got just as excited going through his papers and getting dusty with his history as I did seeing that spacecraft or getting that companion book for Cosmos. So for me, it really had to do with being a lover of language, and language is the main tool of my trade, and marrying that with my passion of space, and really getting that lit on fire with Sagan's Cosmos. And I have to say, Broca's brain too. The romance of science, the perspective he takes, that subtitle, just that phrase, the romance of science, took me to another world. So anyway, that's what got my start and took me along this path.
And it was the pioneering people like Carl Sagan as science communicators that jump-started not only individual authors like yourselves, but cultivated science in daily life, made it something cool, made it something popular, and something to aspire to for the next generation. So we have Carl Sagan to thank for that, and others that came after him for that. What about Emeline? What was your piece of literature that sparked your journey into being an author?
Yeah, speaking of Cosmos, I have the book here. So for me, the series, definitely the TV series in the book, just I think, as Jurek was saying, opened up everybody's minds to science and space for the general public. Which was never kind of like done before. So that was one of the inspirations. For me, the book also, the challenge of the spaceship. So I read this book from Arthur C. Clarke when I was 13, back in the Philippines, and this came out like in 1953. But he was talking about space tourism, satellites, like everything that we have like today, even before we had Sputnik or Gagarin go up in space. So he was definitely a visionary, and unfortunately I was not able to actually meet Arthur C. Clarke in person, but I did correspond with him like later on when he became the chancellor for the International Space University, which I actually became a student of, and we corresponded for a bit, where we tried to. He actually gave us a sponsorship for a Sri Lankan student to come to the program. So that was kind of like one of I think the pivotal moment for me to be thinking about all of this the future of space, and really wanting to be part of it. So in terms of being an author, though, I'm actually quite of an oddball out, probably of all of the authors in the Odyssey series, because I think I came about it by chance. And I was introduced to Chris Dubbs, who is my co-author, and our book was on Realizing Tomorrow: The Path to Private Spaceflight. And it's all about commercial space, and I think I was sort of asked to be part of it because I was actually living it. So my whole career, I've been a space geek for all of my life, and I basically, because of all of these, from Carl Sagan to Arthur C. Clarke, that I've come to realize that the future of humanity is space, and I want to be part of it. And so for me, my life journey is essentially living it. And so being able to have the chance to even write it and share it with other people was really such a delight.
All right, Chris, let's go back to you with this question. As the current generation of space author, what advice would you give to the next generation of space historians and authors that are recording and dictating and sort of exciting the community now at large about the events that are happening, and for the deep space explorations to come? So what would you give? What's your advice to the next generation of space authors that we're soon to see in the years to come?
Well, I'm actually engaging with some of these people since I'm the editor of Quest magazine, and we actually try and encourage sort of younger people come into it and write articles for us. And so, you know, I think kind of the upcoming generation of people have a different viewpoint, and I try and encourage them in that. You know, people who weren't around by Apollo and don't kind of operate under the shadow of Apollo, and just kind of their general lives. They look at things differently. We a couple of years ago, we published a piece on the cupola in the International Space Station, which is quite different from the usual diet that Quest readers get. And yeah, there was a bit of pushback on it, but I was very happy to publish that because it was quite different. But yeah, I mean, a couple of things. You know, I've sort of mentioned Apollo, which you know I love as much as everybody, but I think I think we need to see more on the things that have come after the shuttle and the ISS program. I still don't get many submissions on that, and I would like to see more on that. And of course, in the Hubble book I'm working on right now, that's very much tied into shuttle. It's quite interesting. There's all sorts of things you can do with shuttle, and because it went on for 30 years, you have all sorts of people, a couple of different generations of astronauts, and but also all sorts of people who worked on it. Another thing is there are so many angles to space exploration. You know, there's the astronauts, which everybody gravitates to. We're getting the controllers, that's being covered over. But there's also lots of people who develop various aspects of it. And you know, for example, you know, and often it's the managers, you know, like George Low. I think that's a very good topic. People don't talk about people like him that much. And the first book I did was kind of about some engineers at various levels. Most of them are just up to the level just below George Low, but at varying levels. And things like, for example, in Apollo, you have the rockets and kind of the physical stuff covered over. I would still like to see more about questions like the software. You know, everybody knows that, you know, for example, a lunar module was a pacing item on Apollo, but it was something that could have held it up. So is the software. There are some books, but not that are written that much for the general public. And then you have issues like that in the shuttle and station, and then, you know, private spaceflight is very important. You know, we're coming up, what, 2 or 3 weeks to a big moment in the history of private spaceflight. I think that's going to be the future more as we go ahead, and we need more work on that. So I thought your book was very important. So.
Well, there we go. All our viewers listening in that are aspiring future authors, you have an editor right here that gave you a whole bunch of ideas. So you write those down, listen to this, and start typing away, because you got some things to start working on. And
if you're not
Jay,
up to do a whole book, give me a call.
Yep, here you go. Jay, what would be your piece of advice for the next generation of space authors?
Boy, I know exactly what my piece of advice would be to the next generation of space authors, Joseph, and it would be that you need to know the sources of your sources. And I will give you an example of as brief as I can. In my first book for Outward Odyssey, I was really trying to get at how the Voyager Grand Tour to the outer planets, how did that start? Because going into that project, I was confused because it seemed like all these countries were like sending off these space probes all the time, and why'd they send that one, and why did they send it when they sent it, and all this. And it seemed like every time I would read another book or article or whatever about how Voyager got started, I got a different answer. There was a different name or a different entity or whatever. And I got to the point, I've given a presentation on this, where I had something like 9 credible sources that were all different telling me how this mission got started. And I talked to 2 or 3 Voyager project managers, and they didn't know. And so I got to the bottom of how the Voyager mission really started. And as some people know, I ended up getting sued for my first book because of that. And one thing that people would come back to me with as sort of proof that I was wrong is there's an official NASA publication called the Voyager Neptune Travel Guide. And it came out in August of 1989, which was at the time of Voyager 2's Neptune encounter. And it was sort of like a miniature press kit. It was meant definitely for a general interest public audience. And there's a chapter in it about how these gravity slingshots that Voyager 2 was using, how JPL and other entities started using them, and it laid out the backstory of Voyager 2. And it's wrong. And these people come back to me and say, well, here's an official NASA publication, and and this says that this is how Voyager started. And if you read that publication, there's multiple chapters that were all written by different entities. And the editor for the travel guide is this guy, Charlie Colhase, who was Voyager's mission design manager. And I knew Charlie from working on the project. And so I contacted him and asked him about the history of this publication. And he said, oh my gosh, first of all, my involvement in it is that my name is on the cover. That's it. It was written by all these different people. I had my hands completely full getting ready for Voyager's Neptune encounter. I had practically nothing to do with this. I did not review any of the chapters in it. And the one about the history of Voyager was written by a buddy of this guy who is trying to claim credit for Voyager. It's wrong. I don't know what I can do. I can't go back and change all the tens of thousands of copies that went out. And so here it is out there in the historical record, and it's incorrect if you read it on its face. But if you dig down like an inch below the surface, if you start contacting the people who are behind these things, you get a different story. And I have found that with source after source after source, that I find multiple sources that are all telling me one thing. But if you look at the source that they have in the back of those books, sometimes you'll have 5 different books that all use the same source, and that source is wrong. So
Right.
the advice that I would give to anyone who wants to make a contribution to the historical record is you need to dig down back to the absolute source, the original paper. Like right now I'm working on the history of Galileo to Jupiter. And when it came to this miracle trajectory that saved the mission and everything, I didn't stop until I got to the actual printouts of the trajectory calculations that I got from the guy who made them. It's this is square one for this. And so I would really encourage those students of history to try and get as close to square one as they can. Otherwise, they run a risk.
Well, okay, that's very good advice. Primary sources and checking your sources is always a good thing to go with. Richard, what would be your bit of advice to the next generation of space authors?
Well, other than saying a big amen to what Jay just said, I have a couple short pieces of advice. Number one, I think the biggest thing is something that Chris talked about too, which is one of the appeals to me of the Apollo program and why I think it's the gift that keeps on giving is that it is 400,000 people worked on that program, which means that there are 400,000 stories. And we know there's a lot of stuff written about Apollo come from a marketing and communications background. So when David and I wrote Marketing the Moon, we said it to a couple of friends, and they're like, 2 people are going to read that, guys. Nobody cares about that. But the reality was we cared about it. We were passionate about those trenches, communications, that did the public affairs work, that helped us experience Apollo the way we did. And as I like to say to my son, who's an aeronautical engineer, the poets and the English majors help us get to space just as much as the aeronautical engineers. So my advice to the future writers are follow your passions. You may not be a technical person, but you have an interest and a passion in your life. There isn't a field that doesn't touch space exploration. Even if you're in human resources, if you're a lawyer, if you're into accounting, I don't care the multidisciplinary field that you're in, it's there. And there are so many golden nuggets in that if you take your own personal perspective to it, that you can open up a whole new world to people on some of those same old stories. So that's one piece of advice. My other piece of advice that I would give is sort of grounded in my role as a writer and a researcher for the past 30 plus years professionally. And it comes from the lessons of George Lowe in The Ultimate Engineer, which he had many operating philosophies, but his 2 biggest ones as Apollo program manager after the Apollo 1 fire. Number 1, pay excruciating attention. It's the small details trip you up. It's often not the big ones, but the small ones, sort of like what Jay was talking about the sources. Check your sources, do your homework, get your hands dirty, try and get a primary source, dig, dig, dig. There's something in market research, a concept called expand, focus, expand. And it's kind of done on an infinity loop. When you're going to study a target market from a product, you start with a big scope, the entire target market. And then you come up with buyer personas and things that really come up with the benefits of the product to narrow in. Then you take that subset and you expand it out. And then you analyze into that and you focus in. Expand, focus, expand, dig into those sources, dig into those research. There's rich, fertile soil of untold stories there. The second piece of the operating philosophy of George Lowe was learn to ask the right questions. Many of us go to the astronauts, we go to the program managers, we go to people who worked in mission control, for me, reporters and other people, just a whole a group of people. And if you don't do your homework, you can't come to that subject with the right question. For George Lowe, for example, the famous thing he would use to illustrate that was the door on the Apollo 1 space capsule. The astronauts, among many issues that were with that capsule, one was the difficulty in opening that door and getting them out when the fire broke out. But Lowe said if you looked at it from the engineering challenge, that was a perfect door. That met all the specs in the sense of you didn't want it to open in space. So if you were given a challenge of that door not opening in space, the engineers who designed that designed a great door. They didn't ask the right question, though. What if we had to egress an emergency situation and had to get out quickly and do it on the pad and not in space? So I had that experience with a number of sources when I was writing the Lowe biography. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I learned things as I was going along, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to call back Frank Borman. I just learned this, or I got to call back Glenn Lunny. I've got to get back to Jerry Griffin. And you're using their valuable time. But I found as I went through the process, I got smarter and smarter. And George's advice, while seeming so simple, pay attention to detail, learn to ask the right questions, are fundamental to peeling back the layers of these stories and these narratives and really creating something that'll engage an audience. So I learned quite a bit through that process, and I'd like to pass it on. And if I may, I have a piece of advice for the people who are making space exploration right now. The greatest gift to me in writing the George Low biography is the George Low Archives at RPI in Troy, New York. George Low kept a daily diary when he became Apollo program manager. It was his notes to Bob Gilruth. Every day that he held that job, he reflected, he noted, and he put it down in the historic record. When he became assistant administrator, he wrote down a daily diary note. It is a treasure trove of NASA history that very few people plumb. And I have to say, to the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, as well as just the people in the trenches at SpaceX, Blue Origin, and even NASA working on Artemis, keep diaries, keep notes, write down your reflections, write down your thoughts, because you are making history. And in this world of emails and text message and everything going up in the ether and us not having a paper trail, we lose as historians that deep, rich heritage of information that we can plumb and tell those stories. So please, out there, those people in the space business, keep a diary just for your children and your grandchildren. That's what I have to say.
That's very good advice. Very good advice. Emeline, what would be your amount of advice to the next generation of space authors?
Yeah, it's very hard to tap that advice, because actually I do really agree that we lack historians within the commercial industry today, and it would be awesome to have internal historians that are going along with what these companies are doing today, so that in the future we would know what has happened. But I guess my biggest sort of advice would be, and to start with a premise that the golden years of exploration is still yet to come. I mean, we always think about the golden years is the Apollo era, and that was great. But today, as authors, we interview people, but I think the authors and the writers of tomorrow are going to live it. And so basically the bold recommendation is don't just write it, live it, and then write about it on a first base experience. And because there's a lot of things that's going to happen within the next decade, and I'm actually jealous of the next generation, because they're going to be the ones who will be experiencing all of the things that we've sort of like have been thinking about as science fiction. And the last advice is that write about the unsung heroes. Actually, there's just so many people, there's so many stories of people that are working behind the scenes, not in the limelight, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all of the people that we kind of like know about. But there's a lot of people there that are really working to make things happen, and they're worth telling stories about.
Great. Well, we have reached the part of our talk and our panel that we're going to ask from the viewers some questions off social media. So I have a question pulled from individuals to each one of you. So we'll start back with Chris. And we have Rodney from Atlanta, Georgia asks, who is your favorite astronaut and what did they do?
Oh, there are so many of them, and I think all of us at various times have gotten to meet some. So some of them are friends and all that, and so yes, I admit I'm ragging the puck because there's so many. I I think I think like a lot of people, I I'm something of a Neil Armstrong fan, even though I never met him. Uh, Although I suppose if I'd have put my mind to it, I could have. And uh, just just because he, he was very much a pure engineer, and he actually reminds me of some of the other people I've met along the way, uh, and so uh, you know he's he's one of them, and uh, and then of course I've been meeting a lot in the course of my work on Hubble, and you look at what John Grumsfeld has done, which is uh, which is quite amazing, not only as an astronaut but as an administrator. Um, and and of course, many of the women who've gone into space are quite interesting too. I've gotten to know Kathy Sullivan quite well, and she's written a really excellent book uh, on Hubble, uh, and which I highly recommend. I think it's called Handprints on Hubble. So there's just there there are so many characters there, and there's lots of others. You know, a lot of the Mercury guys I find quite interesting. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there.
All right. Well, Jay, we'll move to you with the next question. And we have Kimberly from Salt Lake City, Utah asks, I like to write stories about my cat named Juno. Oh, appropriate, Juno and Jupiter. And I wanted to know what's the hardest part about writing a book?
Ooh. Well, what is her name? Kimberly?
Kimberly, yeah,
Kimberly.
from Salt Lake.
Well, Kimberly, this is just my opinion, but I think the hardest part for me is staring at the blank page and trying to get those initial thoughts out on the page. I gotta believe that's the hardest part for me, because once you've got it underway and once you kind of have it sort of rough together and everything, then you can start playing around with it and trying to make it better or funny or more interesting or whatever. But I really think the hard part is getting started. And I had somebody talk to me once. This wasn't my suggestion, but he said, you know, Jay, any step that you take is progress. If you just take out a blank sheet of paper from your filing cabinet and lay it on the table in front of you, that's progress. Or if you have to write a paper, even like putting your name at the top of the page, that's still progress. And getting that first chunk of the story drafted out, sometimes I feel like the piece of paper in front of me or the piece of paper on the screen is this big wall, and I just have these blobs of mud, and I'm just like throwing the blobs of mud at the wall, and I'm trying to see what's going to stick. And I think you have to get over the first things that you're going to write in your story, and you just have to get some things out onto the page. And the ideas are, maybe you'll find out they're in the wrong order, or they don't link together really well or whatever, but you've gotten over a huge hurdle by just getting some ideas out there. So that's the, for me, what is the hardest part of writing.
All right. Well, we'll move to Richard. So we have John from Grand Rapids, Michigan asks, I'm 8 years old. What can I look forward to seeing NASA do and NASA go by the time I get to be grown up like you?
Wow. That's a great question. I would like to say I was at NASA headquarters last May to do a presentation to the communication staff with my co-author on my first book. And we were talking Apollo. And a hand went up by a very brave young lady in the back row in this large auditorium. And she said, with all due respect, I understand you're of the Apollo generation, but I'm the Artemis generation. I want to hear about Artemis. And then another hand went up and said, you know, it's interesting. After Apollo, we were told when the shuttle era started, we weren't allowed to talk about Apollo anymore. It was agency policy to stop. Oh. So it's a new page, people. Don't talk about that. Move forward. And what I would say to both of those people, and what I would say to this 8-year-old is, your history is going to be uniquely your own. As much as for anyone else, you may be a part of the Artemis generation, depending on how long that program goes. But that program may spawn multiple programs. It may twist and turn and change into different applications. And there may be multiple programs we haven't even named yet that you'll be part of that generation. And I think Emeline had mentioned it earlier with, I am so jealous. This is what I said to the woman at NASA. As an Apollo generation person, I am even more jealous of the Artemis generation because you have so many shoulders to build upon, so many more opportunities. There is such a momentum in private space right now, and so many exciting developments that your Artemis generation is going to have sub-generations and multiple generations. So what I would say to the 8-year-old is, it's going to be a world that you're going to define, and no matter what adults call it, whether they're Apollo generation adults or Artemis generation adults, it's what you, the 8-year-old, defines it as. Find something that excites you, that gets your pulse racing, that you look at it and you go, I'd like to know more about that. And just follow that thread. And you will guaranteed have an exciting journey, because that thread will continue. As long as humanity is on this planet, we will continue to look up to the stars. We will continue to explore and move outward. And you can be a part of that journey. So that's what I would say to that child.
What great advice. Yeah. All right. So, Emeline, well, with this one, Jessica in Baltimore, Maryland asks, are robots really better at exploring planets than astronauts are? I hope not, because I want to be an astronaut that lives on and explores Mars.
Wow, that's a really deep question. But hi, Jessica from Baltimore. I'm glad that you want to be a robot, well, an astronaut, and maybe a roboticist as well in the future. So there are, I think there are two kind of segments of people kind of like in the space community right now that sort of talks about only robotic missions, and then there's the ones that, you know, human missions are more important. But I'm both. I think that robotics is going to play a really big part in the precursor missions that are going to the moon, to Mars, and maybe to the outer planets. They're basically going to be the scouts to basically assess whether, you know, the places that we're going to go to as humans are basically suitable for either settlement or for long-term kind of like duration of flight. And then the humans will then come after once those precursor missions have actually established kind of like the grounds. And then there's also the reason why I say it's both is I think there's going to be a collaboration between the robots and the humans when we do settle kind of the moon and Mars, because there are still things that are better off. The mechanical things, the laborious kind of jobs that are better suited for robots. And then there's things that are more intellectually more stimulating and gratifying for humans to be working on. And so there's going to be a collaboration between those two, and we'll see both of them kind of like go out into the solar system.
Great. Thank you all for answering the questions from Rodney, Kimberly, John, and Jessica. And wanted to personally thank you on my end and the U.S. Space and Rocket Center's end for your contributions to space, science, communication, and inspiring those next generations of space authors and those that will go and do other things in the fields of STEM. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for inspiring us all, and thank you for being on the panel this afternoon.
Thank you, Joseph. It was
Thanks
great.
so much.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed
With watching, please check out these authors. Please check out their publications, either at your local library, off any purchasing of booksellers of all kinds. Check out their works. They're inspiring, and who knows, from reading those, it may inspire you to be an author as well. So thank you all. Thank you again for attending, and look forward to great things to come.